On September 1, 1939, German forces surged deep into Poland, determined to achieve a swift and total victory, advancing with terrifying speed while facing little resistance across much of the country. Just 20 years earlier, their fathers had marched as well, but then they were returning to their homeland as a defeated army. In November 1918, after 4 years of World War I, Germany's Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, had been forced to abdicate. His armies were being overwhelmed by a relentless offensive from British, French, and U.S. forces. His people were starving, but already a dangerous myth was taking shape. German generals and soldiers claimed they had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by their own cowardly politicians. Even so, at 11:00 in the morning on November the 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, World War I finally ended. The following month, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States arrived in Europe, promising to build a new world order. He convinced the world's leaders to sign up to a new League of Nations. At the Treaty of Versailles, they agreed that from then on, disputes between countries would be settled not through fighting, but through debate in the League. The peoples of Europe were liberated, and Germany's ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was broken apart. From it, new nations emerged: Austria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Germany itself was sharply reduced in size, but this process contained a time bomb. Not everyone welcomed the creation of countries like Czechoslovakia. Several had large German minorities. One day, the wish to reunite the German peoples would return to haunt Europe. The war-ravaged German people also suffered one final humiliation. They were forced to pay a huge £6 billion in reparations to France and Britain, something they could barely afford. And when he returned to America, Wilson's New World Order immediately collapsed. The U.S. Congress decided it could not risk being dragged into another war in Europe. It refused to join his league, and the U.S. retreated into isolationism. Germany was now a very different nation. It was still Europe's largest country, but its militaristic monarchy had disappeared. It had become a democracy, but its government, the so-called Weimar Republic, was soon hit by a series of crushing blows. Street fighting erupted between extreme right-wing nationalists and communists seeking to start a revolution. Then, in 1923, the country was devastated by hyperinflation, which reached hundreds of % each month. Ordinary people's savings vanished. This created fertile ground for a new breed of rabble rousing right-wing politicians. Among them was Adolf Hitler. Hitler had been born in Austria. He had fought bravely as a soldier in World War I and received the Iron Cross. On returning to Germany, he settled in Munich, and his fiery speeches soon allowed him to take control of the small National Socialist, or Nazi, party. In October 1923, Hitler and his followers attempted an armed coup against the Weimar government. It failed, and he was sentenced to 9 months in prison. He wrote a book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he blamed Germany's troubles on the Jews and demanded that it rebuild its strength and seek new lands farther in the east. After his release, he began turning the Nazis into a proper, disciplined political party. From now on, he would use democracy to gain power. But for the next 5 years, Weimar Germany prospered. Support for extremist parties, left and right, declined. Then suddenly, Hitler's chance arrived. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed. Billions of dollars disappeared, and an economic depression swept across the world. Unemployment in Germany climbed to over 6 million. Only extremist politicians seemed to offer an answer. Politicians, like Hitler. By 1931, his Nazis were a genuine mass movement, and they had their own brown-shirted thugs, the SA stormtroops, who numbered almost 3 million. In the 1932 elections, the Nazis became the biggest party in Germany's parliament, the Reichstag. But Hitler refused to join a coalition, leaving parliament deadlocked. To break the stalemate, President Hindenburg made him chancellor in January 1933, head of the government. Within a month, the Reichstag was burned down. Hitler blamed the communists and demanded emergency powers. He then used those powers to ban every other political party. For the next 3 years, the Führer focused on rebuilding Germany's economy. He poured millions into public works, including the 5,000 Mi Autobahn network, to absorb the unemployed, in an effort to put millions of idle Germans back to work and restore confidence in the battered economy, while presenting his government as a force for national recovery and strength. But secretly, Hitler was also spending heavily on a massive rearmament program. Under the Versailles Treaty, the German army had been restricted to 100,000 men. The country was prohibited from having an air force, tanks, or submarines. This small army was tripled in size. Then, in 1935, Hitler went public. He revealed a brand new air force, the Luftwaffe. It possessed 2,500 planes, far more than Britain or France. Unemployment collapsed, and the Nazis became hugely popular. Now confident, the Führer made his first expansionist move. In 1935, he retook the Saarland district along the French border after it voted to return from League of Nations to German control. A year later, he dispatched German troops into the Rhineland, a part of Germany that had been demilitarized at Versailles. At the time, many believed Hitler was simply reclaiming what rightfully belonged to Germany. Neither Britain nor France protested. When Berlin staged the 1936 Olympic Games, the Nazis appeared to many as firm but fair, a government restoring the nation's pride and seemingly threatening nobody. Of course, there were warning signs. The 1935 Nuremberg laws banned Jews from marrying true Aryan Germans and stripped them of their citizenship. But when the first threats to world peace appeared, they didn't come from Hitler at all, but from somewhere else entirely. Japan. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was already a military power. It had defeated Russia in a war in 1905, and it had fought alongside the Allies during World War I. After the war, Japan was a recognized world power, and it joined the League of Nations. But politically, it was a mixture of contradictions. Nominally democratic, the feudal tradition remained powerful. Most Japanese worshipped their emperor as a living god and considered him their true leader. And the country faced serious economic problems. Its population was booming, and it lacked natural resources to power its rapidly growing industries. Its leaders needed answers, and they found them in Chinese Manchuria. Manchuria was a region of rich grain fields, with abundant coal and minerals. It was an ideal target. Japanese troops were already stationed there. Other possible targets included colonies controlled by the European powers, Burma, Malaya, and Hong Kong, ruled by Britain, Indochina, governed by France, and the Dutch East Indies. But at this point, Japan needed to be careful. They did not want to provoke the other great power in the Pacific, the United States. Despite its anti-imperialist slogans, the U.S. actually controlled an unofficial empire across the Pacific. The Philippines, Guam, and several islands were under its direct control. It clearly had the power to challenge Japan, but since World War I ended, it had faced other distractions. This was America's Jazz Age. Throughout the 1920s, the nation focused on exploiting its enormous resources. There was an economic boom that seemed endless. Fortunes were built in both industry and the stock markets. America seemed consumed by the growing pursuit of pleasure. With distractions such as these, Japan's growing ambitions in the Pacific seemed very distant. America had reduced its army after World War I and signed a naval reduction treaty with Britain, France, and Japan. This, effectively, gave naval superiority in the Pacific to the Japanese. Then came the Great Depression. As economic destruction spread, a quarter of the population lost their jobs, tens of thousands became homeless, living in shanty towns. Whereas before pleasure had distracted America, Now pain distracted it. The moment had come for Japan to act. In 1931, without even telling their own elected government, Japanese forces in Manchuria captured the capital, Mukden, and then swept across the rest of the territory. A puppet state, Manchukuo, was declared under a puppet ruler, Henry Puyi, China's last emperor, who had been deposed in 1911 and was pulled from retirement. At its headquarters in Geneva, the League of Nations now confronted its first major test. Japan was condemned around the world, but its response was blunt. Japan, however, found it impossible to accept the report approved by the Assembly. The Japanese simply walked out, and the League suddenly realized there was nothing it could do about Manchuria. Japan was branded an international pariah, but it did not care. Its leaders had set their sights on further conquests in China. These promised easy victories. China was in chaos. The government of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was locked in a struggle with the Chinese Communist Party under Mao. There was civil war. In 1936, as preparation for invasion, the Japanese signed a pact with Hitler. The purpose was to guard against any attack by Soviet Russia should it move against China. Then, in July 1937, the Japanese provoked an incident with Chinese troops and invaded. At first, the Chinese were caught by surprise, but they soon fought back fiercely, with the Communists even joining the Kuomintang. In a united front, the Japanese answered with amphibious landings. By the end of 1937, they had conquered much of northern China and the coast. The Japanese waged this war with extraordinary brutality, bombing cities without discrimination. Westerners living in the commercial heart, the port of Shanghai, were evacuated. The city was then besieged for 3 months. It suffered enormous damage, with Japanese forces showing no pity or concern for the local population. But it was after the capture of Nanking, then the Chinese capital, on December 17, 1937, that Japanese forces truly ran amok. Over 300,000 civilians are estimated to have been massacred during a 6-week orgy of rape and indiscriminate killing. The Japanese even attacked British and U.S. warships that had been sent to protect their shipping and trade. The worst incident came on December 12, 1937. The American gunboat Panay was sunk by Japanese bombers. 50 crewmen died. Despite this, the Western powers refused to intervene, leaving the League of Nations powerless. In the United States, President Roosevelt wanted to impose a naval blockade on Japan. It had become clear that acts and policies of nations in other parts of the world could have far-reaching effects on us. But the British would not accept it, fearing that it might provoke a war. So all Roosevelt could offer was a $25 million loan to Chiang Kai-shek to purchase arms. Even though the Communists were now fighting alongside the Kuomintang, the Soviet Union did little to help either side. Its only involvement was a series of clashes along its own border with Manchuria. But China itself received nothing. Instead, it was forced to fight on alone. During 1938, the Japanese captured Canton and drove the Chinese forces deeper into the west of the country. All the rhetoric of the League of Nations, all those promises to halt international aggression, had achieved nothing. And by now, the Western powers were confronting aggression much closer to home. Today, it is easy to laugh at Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. All that posturing seems slightly ridiculous now, but it did not seem that way in 1922. Back then, Italy appeared to be on the brink of anarchy. The country was torn apart by strikes and land seizures. The democratic government, just as in Germany, seemed powerless against such unrest. So Benito Mussolini, a war veteran and journalist, decided to act. He organized a right-wing nationalist party, the Fascists. With the country paralyzed by a general strike in August 1922, Mussolini ordered his followers to march on Rome. Fearing civil war, Italy's King Victor Emmanuel asked him to form a government. Mussolini quickly crushed all political opposition and assumed dictatorial powers. Government was appointed instead of elected, and all power was firmly placed in the hands of the fascist Grand Council. Like Hitler, Mussolini's first actions made him immensely popular. Massive public works programs provided employment and transformed Italy's infrastructure. Corruption was rooted out, and the mafia more or less eliminated. Italy's armed forces were expanded, including an advanced modern air force. In the Mediterranean, Mussolini created a powerful navy, larger than the combined strength of the British and French Mediterranean fleets. When the Great Depression arrived, Italy seemed to endure it better than most. Mussolini became a source of worldwide inspiration. Political leaders, not least Adolf Hitler in Germany, viewed the fascist system as a model, strong and purposeful, compared with the weakness of the democracies in Britain and France. But Mussolini wanted more than admiration. He wanted to recreate the Roman Empire, and he already had a target for his first imperial conquest. His target was Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia. Italy already had colonies along its borders in Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. In December 1934, Italian forces provoked a clash with Abyssinian troops at an oasis in the Ogaden region, deep inside Abyssinian territory. Mussolini then sent reinforcements to Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, demanding that Abyssinia pay reparations. The Emperor of Abyssinia, Haile Selassie, appealed personally to the League of Nations. He called on it to uphold its ideals. Here was a small nation threatened by another member of the League. This was the ultimate test, but the League did nothing. Britain's Foreign Minister, Anthony Eden, at least tried to negotiate a peace deal, but Mussolini would not accept it. In early October 1935, the Italian army invaded from Eritrea and Italian Somalia. The primitive Abyssinian forces stood little chance against a modern army equipped with artillery and tanks. The Italian Air Force controlled the skies completely and harassed the Abyssinians, sometimes dropping gas bombs, even though gas had been outlawed at Versailles as a crime against humanity. After 6 months, Abyssinia was completely overrun. Emperor Haile Selassie fled into exile in Britain. From its headquarters in Switzerland, the League of Nations wrung its hands. It did impose economic sanctions, but they had little effect. Mussolini's aggression had exposed two things. The League of Nations, that great hope for peace, was powerless, and both of Europe's supposed major powers. The democracies Britain and France no longer had the stomach for a fight. Both Britain and France had been devastated by World War I, and their economies had never truly recovered. Both had experienced waves of strikes and unrest. Both had suffered mass unemployment even before the Great Depression. Both also faced the cost of controlling empires, now enlarged by taking on Germany's former colonies and the Middle Eastern territories once controlled by the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And above all, both had been traumatized by the terrible casualties of World War I. A succession of British leaders, Lloyd George, Ramsay MacDonald, and above all Stanley Baldwin, all resolved to keep Britain out of future conflicts. Despite terrible casualties on the Western Front, Britain had ended World War I with a large and highly effective conscript army. This was immediately reduced to a small professional force designed to police its sprawling empire, and when the Great Depression struck, any plans for modernizing the army were abandoned. It meant that Britain entered the run-up to war economically and militarily weak. French losses during World War I had been even worse than Britain's. Ever distrustful of the Germans, a large conscript army was maintained, but throughout the 1920s France's birth rate declined. It became clear that there would be a manpower shortage by the mid to late 1930s. France realized it could never compete with Germany through army size alone. The answer was to adopt an entirely defensive mentality. The Maginot Line, a series of fortifications, was begun in 1930 along the frontier with Germany and extended as far as the Belgian border. There, it theoretically connected with fortifications planned by the Belgians. This new French military approach meant that France was capable only of fighting a defensive war. It simply did not have the ability to launch an attack on Italy, even if the British had possessed the troops to help. In practice, this left France with little choice but to prepare for defense rather than plan any offensive campaign of its own. And, naturally, both countries knew that their Mediterranean navies were outnumbered by Mussolini's new fleet. So when Italy conquered Abyssinia, it seemed sensible for both powers to do nothing. It simply appeared too distant, too much somebody else's problem. By now, they both had to cope with all the traumas of the Great Depression that seemed far more urgent, and above all, they were now facing a military threat much closer to home. A resurgent and rearming Germany, and the power of Germany and Italy too, was soon to be demonstrated through supporting the rise of another dictator in Spain. In 1936, civil war broke out in Spain. It was exceptionally brutal, setting family against family, communist against fascist, believers against atheists. In 1931, a left-wing government had taken power, determined to abolish the centuries-old Spanish monarchy. The king was driven into exile, and a republic was declared. In February 1936, the parties of the left united in a popular front to challenge the forces of the right in a general election. The Popular Front won narrowly. Even though its reform program was modest, a wave of strikes and land seizures caused the right to fear that a communist takeover was inevitable. Within the Spanish army, long a stronghold of conservative and Catholic thinking, senior officers began considering the possibility of a coup. Among them was General Francisco Franco, the former chief of staff who had been effectively exiled to command Spain's forces in the Canary Islands. On July 17, 1936, army units fighting guerrillas in Spain's colony in Morocco mutinied. The next day, Franco flew to join them, declaring a new nationalist movement that would save Spain from communism. Mainland garrisons now joined the rebellion. The Popular Front responded by calling for volunteers to defend the Republic. The battle lines were drawn. At first, Franco faced difficulties. He and his army were in North Africa, and he needed to cross the Straits of Gibraltar to return to Spain. So he turned to the one person he believed might help, Adolf Hitler. Within a month, transport aircraft from Hitler's new Luftwaffe had begun an airlift, carrying Franco's battle-hardened veterans over to southern Spain. At this stage, the Republic still seemed to hold the advantage. The pro-Franco military uprisings in Madrid and Barcelona were quickly crushed, leaving it in control of most of eastern Spain. Franco's nationalists were confined largely to the northwest and part of the south. But the nationalist position changed when Hitler and Mussolini began pouring in troops and weapons. The German dictator seized the chance to test his new equipment and expanding armed forces. The first panzer tanks were sent along with some 12,000 troops, while the Luftwaffe deployed its Condor Legion with ultra-modern new bombers and fighters. Mussolini sent a so-called volunteer corps of 50,000 men and more than 700 aircraft. The Republicans appealed desperately to Britain, France, and the Soviet Union for help, but London and Paris feared triggering a European war. They declared a policy of non-intervention. Cynically, Germany and Italy both signed up to this, but when it became from these ideas, they developed the concept of fast-moving units combining tanks, artillery, and infantry that could drive rapidly and deeply into enemy territory. Hitler embraced their ideas enthusiastically. The new army was to have 3 panzer divisions. Similarly, the new Air Force, the Luftwaffe, under former World War I fighter ace Hermann Göring, had a foundation to build upon. Throughout the years when its Air Force was officially banned, Germany had maintained its design abilities by constructing civilian aircraft, while gliding and flying clubs provided a reserve of potential pilots. Hitler revealed the existence of the Luftwaffe in March 1935. He then announced that the army would be expanded to 300,000 men, and conscription was restored. Britain and France protested weakly at this blatant violation of the Versailles Treaty. But soon they reluctantly and gradually began to rearm. Until this point, Hitler had kept his ambitions limited. He had only reclaimed what he considered his, the Rhineland and Saarland. But now he had a larger target in mind. His homeland, Austria, in 1934, Austrian Nazis had tried to seize power and unite the country with Germany. The Austrians, after all, spoke German, even though they had never belonged to a German state. In February 1938, another Nazi plot was uncovered. Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg protested to Hitler. Hitler responded by demanding that Austria stop mistreating the Austrian Nazis and unite with Germany. A referendum was planned so that the Austrians could vote on whether to remain independent. But on March 12, 1938, the eve of the referendum, Hitler, fearing it might produce the wrong result, sent in his troops. Complete surprise and an enthusiastic welcome from Nazi sympathizers made it a bloodless invasion. Within hours, Hitler announced Austria's incorporation into the Third Reich. For the first time, a sovereign nation had been absorbed into a greater Germany. Once again, the Western democracies failed to respond. In the summer of 1938, he turned toward his next target, Czechoslovakia. A substantial German minority lived in the northwest of the country, a region known as the Sudetenland. These Sudeten Germans had belonged to the old Austrian Empire, but had been separated when Czechoslovakia was created in 1919. This was the time bomb that had begun ticking when the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Hitler encouraged Sudeten German demands for autonomy and then threatened the Czech government with force if it refused. Undaunted, the Czech government ordered general mobilization and prepared to resist. The Czechoslovak army was large and well-equipped, with powerful fortifications along its frontier with Germany. Hitler backed down, but then, at the beginning of September, worried that war might be imminent, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decided to intervene as a peacemaker. He flew to meet Hitler twice. The Nazi dictator assured him that if he could have the Sudetenland, he would make no further territorial demands in Europe. In Munich, on September 29, 1938, with Mussolini acting as mediator, France and Britain signed an agreement handing the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for a formal declaration by Hitler that he had no further territorial ambitions. Chamberlain flew back to Britain, waving the piece of paper which he claimed guaranteed peace in our time. And so, on October 1st, German troops occupied the Sudetenland and captured the Czech frontier fortifications. Hitler now began considering his next target, Poland. Again, the stated reason was a German minority stranded as a result of the Versailles Treaty. Hitler demanded the return of the port of Danzig to German control so that East Prussia could be connected with the rest of Germany. The Poles refused, and Hitler hesitated. He was not yet ready for all-out war, and he still had unfinished business with Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, the eastern part of the country, Slovakia, which was ethnically different from the Czech lands, appealed to Hitler for help in gaining greater independence. Hitler summoned the Czechoslovak Prime Minister Emil Hucha to Berlin and intimidated him into placing his country under German protection. German troops now marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia without opposition. Most of the country was annexed into the Reich. Slovakia was declared a protectorate. For the first time, Hitler had seized territory where German was not the main language. But again, there was only a weak protest from Britain and France. At the end of March, he repeated his demand to Poland, give up Danzig. This time, France and Britain declared unequivocally that they would declare war if he attacked Poland. But by now, Hitler cared little whether they did or not. He was convinced that they would prove weak and indecisive opponents. In Russia, Stalin had also grown increasingly worried about Hitler's aggression. In April, Stalin proposed an alliance with Britain and France, but negotiations achieved little progress. Finally, Stalin gave up hope, deciding that there was another answer to the German threat. On August 23rd, the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, whom everyone had believed were sworn enemies, announced a non-aggression pact. The agreement secretly stated that Poland would be divided between the two countries, while Stalin would have a free hand to seize Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Now free from any Russian threat, Hitler ordered his armed forces to prepare for an immediate invasion. On the evening of August the 31st, the German Wehrmacht prepared for the assault. Its Führer had made the decision that would plunge the world into war. Obvious, they were still sending arms to the nationalists. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, announced that he would help the Republic. Stalin's concern was the growth of fascism in Germany. Hitler had made it abundantly clear that he considered communism to be Nazism's ultimate enemy. Stalin saw the Spanish conflict as a way to keep Germany and Italy occupied, while strengthening the Soviet Union's military power. About 700 military advisors were sent, together with tanks and fighter aircraft. It was something, but it could not match the support Franco had received. In fact, the largest source of outside help for the Republic did not come from a country at all, but from volunteers. The international brigades. About 30,000 left-wing Americans, British, French, and Germans volunteered to fight in Spain. With their new fascist support, the nationalists could open two fronts, one advancing toward Barcelona from the north, the other led by Franco pushing toward Madrid from the south. By the end of 1936, Madrid was surrounded on three sides and virtually under siege. The fighting was fierce and often accompanied by appalling atrocities against civilians. The Republicans hunted down and murdered Roman Catholic priests. The nationalists slaughtered anyone accused of being communist. German and Italian air power was used indiscriminately against civilian targets. Madrid was heavily bombed, but the worst incident came in April 1937, when the Basque town of Guernica was virtually destroyed, with 6,000 civilian deaths. The territory controlled by the Republic was steadily worn down. Its forces fought with great courage, but poorly trained and badly equipped amateurs were no match for the professional soldiers led by Franco or the combined modern weapons of Italy and Germany. As the war continued, the fighting around Madrid became a symbol of the left's determination not to be crushed by a fascist dictatorship. But behind the scenes, the Republican alliance was breaking apart. The communists and socialists wanted to focus on winning a military victory. But the more idealistic anarchists and syndicalists saw the war as a chance for a mass revolution by the workers. These disagreements erupted openly in May 1937. Fighting broke out in Barcelona between the anarchists and communists. It was a fatal weakening of the Republican cause. By the end of 1938, the nationalists had squeezed their enemy into a small enclave around Barcelona and another stretching eastward from Madrid to the coast. Madrid continued to resist, but the international brigades were withdrawn. More and more nations began recognizing Franco's government as his forces moved in for the final assault on Madrid. At the end of March 1939, its defenders, exhausted after nearly 3 years of fighting, the capital finally surrendered. A month later, Franco formally declared hostilities ended. The scars of Spain's civil war took years to heal, and in some ways, they never did. And internationally, Franco's victory over the Republic proved disastrous. Hitler and Mussolini were confirmed in their belief that the democracies of Britain and France were powerless to resist serious pressure, while Stalin lost faith in their willingness to confront fascism. Hitler, in particular, saw the way open to begin the aggressive policies outlined in Mein Kampf. Even before the Spanish Civil War ended, his armies were already marching. From the moment he became Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933, Hitler had begun putting his long-term ambitions into action. On February 3rd, he told his top commanders that his ultimate aim was to conquer territory in the east and ruthlessly Germanize it. They were ordered to prepare for a massive expansion. Although Germany had been forbidden tanks, a secret treaty with the Soviet Union in 1923 had permitted the development of tank designs and experimentation with new mobile armored tactics. Energetic young German officers like Heinz Guderian studied the theories of British thinkers like Basil Littlehart and Colonel John Fuller. They even watched exercises conducted by the British during the 1920s on Salisbury Plain. These lessons would later help shape the tactics that German forces would use with devastating effect when the next war finally began across Europe in 1939 and the world again.